Hey, everybody, before we start the show, I wanted to remind you that I have written an original role playing game from the ground up for the Roll20 virtual tabletop platform. Head on over to burnbright.com to learn more. Bright is spelled Bryte. Burn Bright is a science fantasy game where you take on the role of an alien to us creature who has superpowers. It is awesome. It is fun. It is an end of the world scenario which dares you to hope at the end of existence. Pretty awesome. You get to hang out with your spaceship and all of your cool alien superhero friends, help people in need, and maybe save the galaxy. Go check it out, burnbright, Bryte.com. This is Tabletop Babble. I'm James Introcaso. Today on the show, we're talking with Jay Gray of R. Talsorian Games. Jay is just an incredible designer and really does it all. So we are going to jump right into our interview. All right, everybody. Now I am here with a great game designer, very prolific, has worked on a lot of amazing products. Jay, welcome to Tabletop Babble. For people who don't know, who are you and what do you do in the world of tabletop role-playing games?
My name is Jay Gray. Professionally, currently, I am the media ambassador for R. Talsorian Games. I am also a designer, writer, editor, and layout artist.
Yeah, you're kind of doing it all. If you could draw some maps and creatures, you would just be making your own books and have no need for the rest of us.
Oh, if I could do art, my life would be so much better.
I feel the same way. So take me all the way back, Jay. When did you first lay hands on a tabletop role-playing game as a player or GM? What were you playing? What was the game? Break it down for me.
Oh, well, I first laid hands on it way back when, in my hometown, small little hometown, which somehow had a comic shop. And in that comic shop, back in the day, I'm old enough that this is true, the TSR had published the first Marvel superheroes RPG. They had the license, first of all, and they released it in box sets, basic and advanced set. And there on the shelf was the basic set, and I was like, oh, I get to make my own superheroes. That's kind of neat. So I picked that up and took it home and made many a superhero, and no one who wanted to play with me. So 6 or so years later, I finally got to actually play a tabletop role-playing game, which was Star Wars, the old West End D6 game. And from there, fortunately, college was a lot better than high school for finding people to game with. And I haven't looked back since.
Wow. That is awesome. And also, what a cool sort of first game. I don't get a lot of TSR Marvel role-playing game responses to that question. So that's really fun. So then at what point, does this become a professional pursuit for you?
Many years later, not until my late 30s, actually. And at that point, the OGL market, we've gotten past the 3.5 stage, and we were in the Pathfinder, is dominant part of the market. And I happen to be getting back into gaming, and when diving deep into the Paizo forums, and they were running their Superstar contest. I'd said, hey, I can do that. So I submitted and didn't make it past the second round, but it gave me the idea to start talking to other people. And there's tons of small publishers at the point putting out original Pathfinder content, or content for Pathfinder, I should say. And I had been playing Dragon Age 2 at the time. And in Dragon Age 2, the sorcerers, the mages, they have a staff, and the staff can shoot balls of energy at opponents that are not spells. And I thought, how neat is that you can have the wizard, sorcerer, magic class can have a magically based weapon that feels on brand for them but doesn't take spell slots. And as a result, I can do any, I don't have to do offensive spells. I don't have to worry about my combat spells. I thought, wouldn't that be neat? In Pathfinder, I wrote the book. It got published by a small publisher called Flaming Crab Games, and from there I was like, oh, well, then I can do this.
Wow, that's awesome. And this is like your full-time gig now? This is what you do?
Yes, this is what I do. A couple of years after that, I 5 or 6 years after that, I am doing this working full time for R. Talzorian Games.
And so what are some of the games people might know from R. Talzorian?
R. Talzorian Games was founded in the 1980s, and we are most famous for Cyberpunk. There's a video game coming out in September. Some people have probably heard of it, Cyberpunk 2077, which is based on the Cyberpunk role-playing game.
Right. And that's with surprise Keanu Reeves in the video game trailer, right?
Yes. He is playing Johnny Silverhand, who was a key NPC, iconic, if you will. He's our iconic rocker boy from back in the first edition, published in the late 80s. So the character has been around for quite a while. And now we're getting to see him played by Keanu Reeves, which is just mind-blowing.
So what else do you have over there at R. Talzorian?
Well, we are the publishers of the official Witcher tabletop role-playing game, which we are currently working on a bestiary for. We are also the publishers of Teenagers from Outer Space, which is an anime comedy role-playing game. We are the publishers of Mechton, which is a giant robot build-your-own anything that exists, from Bubblegum Crisis hardsuits to Jaegers from Pacific Rim to Transformers. All possible. They're all. It's very much a if you can imagine it, you can build it sort of system. And Cyber Generation, which is I like to say, kids on hoverboard fighting the establishment.
Yes.
Yeah. And then finally, Castle Falkenstein, which is my baby, and it is high adventure in the steam age. It's fact, fantasy, and fiction. I don't call it steampunk because it focuses more on the romantic adventure, glory, and honor sort of aspect of things, as opposed to the more punk, dirty London streets, while the steam lords are controlling everything side of the genre. I like to make it akin to going to the Renaissance Fair. It's sort of a Ren Fair is sort of like the Middle Ages, the way they should have been, and Falkenstein is more like the Victorian period, the way it should have been as well.
Yeah, this is really, really cool. So, where did you get the idea for this game? Where did it come from?
Well, I can't say that Falkenstein is. When I say it's my baby, I am currently kind of in charge of it, but it is not my original game. It, like many things, was developed from a company developed by Mike Pondsmith, the company CEO, founder, and creator of Cyberpunk and Teenagers, as well as Falkenstein. And the idea came to him. Basically, he was in Europe. He was taking a tour of the great castles of Europe, and it just said, "Wow, what if this?" And there's a very famous castle which Ludwig II was supposed to build. He never quite got around to it, though. There's some architectural drawings of it, and it was used as the basis of the great Disney castles. And he said, "Well, what if it was?" And then he went further and out from there, and so he developed this entire world where all the fictional things in Victorian literature, Nemo and so forth, Captain Nemo, Sherlock Holmes, they all exist, but so do all the fairy legends and secret societies of sorcerers. And then you have the steam technology as well. So it's this mishmash, beautiful mishmash of things that all work beautifully together, with a history that resembles ours but isn't quite like ours. And then it came from there. It was an experiment in rules light at a time when there wasn't a lot of rules light in the around 94, using playing cards instead of dice, because that was more thematically appropriate.
Cool. And so the line you're working on today has been updated since then. Are you still using playing cards?
Yes, absolutely. There are currently 10 books in the line. 3 books we just released. They were originally published by Fat Goblin Games under a license, which I actually was the lead on those as well, which is how I got it in R. Talzorian. And they still use cards. The rules with the new books have gotten tighter and less open to interpretation, if you know what I mean. There's rules light can be very rules light, to the point where the GM's the host in this case, is making up things on the fly. And the newer books try to close some of those gaps so that it's still rules light, but there's less pressure on the host to come up with rulings off the bat. And if people really want to play with dice, in one of the books, which was just released today, Variations on the Great Game, there are over at Drive-Thru RPG, there are dice rules for it, but even those are unusual because in Falkenstein, each playing card suit represents a type of action. So clubs are physical actions, diamonds are intellectual actions, and so forth. And that's hard to simulate with dice. So with the dice, you have a bowl of 4 color sets of poker chips if you want to do that, or dice, or whatever beads, color beads, whatever markers you want to use. And you draw them, and so you have a handful of a pool of these beads or dice, these counters, and you turn them in for dice to affect a certain specific action.
Cool. That is very fun and a cool way of doing things. So what about some of the other R. Talsorian lines? What have you worked on as a designer?
As a designer, I have done mostly work on Witcher. I was a co-designer on Easy Mode, which is our quick start for The Witcher, also available for free on Drive-Thru RPG. And in the upcoming Witcher's Journal, which is our bestiary, I wrote an investigation system which takes essentially mysteries and turns them into a system which a GM can work with to create mysteries and run them. Mysteries can be some of the hardest things to run because mysteries are hard to write. You know, you make these clues and you have no guarantee your players are going to understand them or pick up on them. And then also mysteries are often in this weird place, like puzzles, where they seem to rely more on how good the players are as opposed to how good the characters are. Right. If you know what I mean. So you can have a player who's really good at solving mysteries playing a dumb character, and where is the line between that, a character with a low intelligence stat, and where is that line? Where is that the character couldn't possibly solve this mystery, but the player can, and this helps find that midpoint where essentially mysteries are treated almost like a monster with essentially a health bar, a health pool. And as you find clues, which it guides you through the different kinds of normal clues you would find in a mystery, and where you might find them, and helps you plot out how to put clues and how to create a chain of them in a plot. As you find those clues, the clues damage the health of the mystery, and when it reaches 0, it's solved. And then, of course, it talks about what if the players figured out beforehand, and that could be a case of, they figured it out beforehand, great for them, they solved it. Or it could be a case of, well, they solved it, they know who the person is, but the authorities aren't satisfied, they don't have enough evidence. So you have some options there. So basically the idea was to create a system that works to guide GMs who maybe want to do mysteries but aren't great at it, and to guide players as well by giving them specific sorts of clues they can find planned out in advance. And the reason it's in the bestiary is because, of course, in Witcher, in the video games, oftentimes you investigate to figure out what kind of monster is attacking or what kind of monster you're hunting, and that gives you advanced knowledge as to what equipment you need, what techniques you need. And so we thought, well, we wanted to simulate that. So it started as a monster hunting simulator and then turned into a full investigation system.
Yeah. What is that like when you're working with an IP that isn't something that you created yourself, right? And it's an IP, but R. Talsorian Games didn't create The Witcher. They created the role-playing game. What is that like?
It's interesting. On one hand, it's not too different than working in any kind of IP, whether it's yours or not, because a lot of it comes down to my technique tends to be I immerse myself in the genre. Like if I'm writing steampunk, I'll read steampunk stuff. I will play steampunk games. I'll force my mind into the right path by diving into the media of the genre. Same is true with cyberpunk or fantasy. And with Witcher, it's just a narrower genre. It's a genre of one IP. But fortunately, we've got video games, and we've got a TV series, and we've got, a Netflix series, and we've got books. And so it's fairly easy to dive in and just get my brain attuned to it. And from there, it's a case of doing my best to follow the feel of it and get the lore right. And fortunately, we have people who work with us to look at when we look at not only are we doing it right, but are we doing the lore correctly? Did we get our facts right? And that helps a lot. So inevitably we get things wrong. We get the wrong date, or we put the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time in the timeline, or we mention a place that no one would have been there yet, and someone says, "Hey, that's a problem. You got to fix that," and we go back and fix it.
I mean, that's a great way to work. And it's one of those things where people probably have a lot of expectations because they know the books, the video games, now the television show. How tied to those expectations are you, and how important is it for you to get the fans' vision correct?
It's really as important to a point. There's a lot of different Witcher fans coming. Some are coming from the books, some are coming from the game, some are coming from the Netflix show, and we are not going to get every vision right because people have different interpretations. But there is kind of a common thread which runs through all three, and it's important because it's like going to a movie based on a comic book, and you can tell right away watching it whether the people making it understood the comic book. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. The facts, it doesn't have to be a panel for panel remake of the comic book, but if the heart's not there, the movie's not good.
Yeah, I think about that a lot because sometimes you get a filmmaker who does make something close to a shot-for-shot remake, but the heart isn't there, right?
Yes.
And it's like, wow, this is faithful, but not faithful.
Yeah, no, it's technically faithful, but there's that thing missing, that heart at the base of the character. And it's the same thing with Witcher. We want to make sure everything works. We had just recently revealed the cover for Witcher's Journal, and I think the best comment I got on it, and it just which made my art director's day, was someone said, "I saw this and I thought that is the best Witcher fan art I've ever seen," because it came up on Facebook and they hadn't realized it was in our Witcher group that we were showing it off as a cover. They just thought someone had posted some Witcher. And the thing is, no character from The Witcher is in it on that cover either. It's an original character we made for this book. But they immediately recognize it as and there's no super obvious Witcher. There was no text on it saying it was Witcher. There was no big icon like the Witcher medallion on it. But they saw it and they said, "Oh, that's a Witcher piece," before they even realized it was a Witcher piece. And that was just amazing just to hear that. So it means a lot, and we work hard, and everyone that works on the line is a super fan of Witcher, and that's important.
Hey everybody, just wanted to take a quick break to let you know that this episode of Tabletop Babble is brought to you by Elderwood Academy. Elderwood Academy is an incredible store where you can buy handcrafted gaming products made from wood and leather and so much more. They have some really, really cool stuff. For instance, you could get the old Acquisitions Incorporated logo on a Spellbook box. Spellbook box is this box that has all of these custom foam inserts so you can carry around your dice, your pencils, or whatever. It'll be the best looking thing at your gaming table, and it's AI branded. Plus, they've got so much other AI branding. I'm talking about rolling trays and dice towers and things like that. So much more. They've got that AI partnership. So much cool stuff to check out when you go to elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. That's elderwoodacademy.com/don't-split. Let's get back to the babble.
When you're working on a game like Castle Falkenstein, is that right? Castle Falkenstein?
Stein, different people pronounce it different ways. I switch back and forth depending on how lazy I feel today and whether I want to get that extra German oomph into it or not.
Gotcha. So when you're working on a game like that has a history behind it, when you sit down, how faithful are you to old rules? Like what do you need it for it to still remain that game that people know, but also be updated and understood?
Oh, see, a lot of this is intuitive and it's hard to put into words.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of it is that you have to know the material, and that helps a lot. And this is true in general of anything. If I were in DM's Guild working on a Forgotten Realms product, for example, and I'd never read Forgotten Realms, I wouldn't expect anyone to think I had done a good job representing the realms. And I think it's true there. So, I need to know the material, and there's a lot of going back and rereading, because even though I've read all the books multiple times, it's a lot of data to keep in my head, and also it keeps it fresh. But for the rules, I think that's a big thing. And that's, I think anybody in any working on a new edition or a new rule supplement for a game struggles with, because you want to update the rules, and gaming evolves over time. And new ideas come forward, and new ways of doing things, and you don't want to stay static. You don't want your game to be exactly the same, because there might be new ways to do things, but you can't wander too far afield either. 4E D&D is probably the best example. 4E D&D was a game I enjoyed. It was a good game. It was a good design. But for a lot of people, it didn't carry that feel for it. It moved too far afield. You know what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I think that's a great example. Keep going.
Yeah, 5E moved back towards that, where it felt more like an update and less like all the old rules were thrown out and new rules were written. And that's generally the same with Falkenstein. Is in the end, for example, I would never take the base ideas away. I would never take the cards away. I would never take the idea of the 4 suits representing 4 different kinds of actions away, because those are just key to what it is. That's that feeling of it. And I think if you get those base elements in there, you don't need THAC0, but you do need saves. And without saves, it doesn't feel like D&D. If you go too far afield with the stats, if they're not strength and con and so forth, and if you suddenly say, oh no, D&D is classless, all that, it's all the same. It's with Falkenstein, there are fewer core concepts, but those core concepts have to remain, and they have to be honored.
Again, all of this is super important, and I think it's great advice about preserving core concepts. And it's funny, I think you can see some core concepts shift over time, but it happens very slowly, right?
Yes.
Like if you look at D&D, the idea of having a race and a class wasn't there at the beginning, right? You just had a class, and like dwarf and elf were classes, and then that got added in, and so those core concepts can change over time, but I feel like changing them too harshly or too quickly, I should say, does make the game feel like it is no longer that game.
Yeah, well, it's like nowadays 1d10 or 1d whatever, 1d20, a roll plus a stat plus a skill or plus a bonus, I guess you would call it in 5e, is a core concept of a lot of games. But there was a time when that was revolutionary, back when actually when we published Teenagers from Outer Space, and when Jonathan Tweet put out Ars Magica. Those were 2 of the first games with that basic concept in it, and it was mind-blowing at the time.
Yeah, and again, right, I think we all like to joke about things like THAC0 now, but at the time we didn't understand that maybe there was an alternative.
True.
And now we know, and I think that's great.
Yep. And THAC0, for all we joke about it, actually solved a really big problem of the time. It wasn't until later that, after playing it, it got smoothed out even further. But at the time, it was before THAC0. Actually, I think I know a lot of people would prefer it, but it was a lot more complex.
Yeah. It was basically the GM had to consult a chart, right? And that was the only way to know.
Yeah. And charts aren't bad, but in general, you should be able to run combat smoothly and with your basics. And knowing if you hit or not is a fairly basic thing.
Yeah. So what do you like in a game? Like if you're sitting down to design something for a game, what's your process like? How do you start?
I start with thinking about it for a very long time, often too long. I let it wander around in my head and decide, am I going to do this, that, the other thing? Get some solid ideas. And then I outline with bullet points. And then I start writing, and a lot of times there's a lot of there's some testing involved. Does this rule work? Does this rule work? Especially mechanics. But a lot of it is just once I have that bullet points, I can just start filling in the blanks and it is like that. And I try not to. My mind wants to go from start to finish, but I try not to get locked into that.
Right.
Because if I get stuck on the start, I can't do anything else. But it happens. And also there's a big thing there is I try not to get down on myself if I do come up against the block, because everybody does. The best minds in the business do. They get to a point where they can't do anything else and they have to take a break and come back to it. And that's something I've been learning, especially I've had a great opportunity to meet a number of luminaries in our hobby. And I find for the most part, it's all the same for them. Some of them can create something all the time, but none of them can consistently create the same thing every time, all the time.
So what about when you are putting something together and you're working with a team? Do you like manage a team of writers and look at their stuff? And how does that workflow look like?
I have done that. I'm not doing so currently. In the past, I have done for a number of small third-party publishers for Pathfinder, where I was the lead on the team, and there was people working under me, and it was fairly simple. They were smaller books, which means they weren't as complex as they could be, but I would come up with a concept. I'd often come up with basic ideas of what I wanted in each section. I'd assign them and I'd say, go for it. And then they would, feel free to ask me questions. I would answer them. They get it back to me. And then after that point, my job was to take it and not rewrite it, but tweak it so there was a consistent voice throughout the product. So that it didn't sound like 3 different people were writing it.
Wow.
So when I'm just part of a team, that's somebody else's job, and I just kind of work on it. Though I do enjoy the zeitgeist of being able to communicate and saying, I'm working on this and they're working on that, and exchanging ideas and say, oh yeah, well, for this particular race, I came up with this idea, and they said, oh, that's a great idea. What if we extend that and make a series of feats based around it? And so forth. And I like that creativity that can come from working together.
I love collaboration like that. You're a person who wears many hats. At the beginning of this, you mentioned that you not just design, but you edit, and you can do layout. I would love to talk with you a little bit about layout, because I don't do layout. It's a little bit of a mystery to me. And I can tell, right, when something looks really good, and I can tell when something does not look as good. But I don't know how to make those things happen. And I don't know what it is, right? I'm just like, well, this looks better than this one. But I don't know what the difference is. For somebody just getting started in layout, what are some of your tips that you have?
Okay. It's tough. One of the biggest barriers for layout is the fact that InDesign, which is the industry standard, it's kind of the world standard, is not a cheap piece of software.
Sure. Yeah.
Though you can get a less expensive layout program called Affinity, which I'm hearing good things about, though I haven't checked out myself. So there are important things to know. And there are some things which just, you learn through trial and error. Know that there are, for anything you can do in these programs, there is a video out there showing you how to do it. So that's important. Learn the basics, learn what a style is, learn what a master page is. Those are all important technical terms, but they're also important for layout. And master page is a non-page in your layout design, which contains all the elements that appear on every page. So for example, if you've got a textured background that appears on every page, you put that on your master page. You don't put it on every page in your layout. You just put it on there once, and it shows up each time. Styles you see them in Word and word processors these days. They are essentially ways to specifically format text or images. So, for example, if you want every one of your images to have a frame around it, like a black border, that would be a style. If you want all your text to appear in this font at this size, fully justified, that's a style. And what's nice about styles is they save you a lot of work. You don't have to go through and highlight and then change each one of them, or change them as you type. You just put it in your cursor in the paragraph, select the style, and it changes the entire paragraph, which is everything up into the hard return to that style. It's a gorgeous thing. Beyond that, the biggest thing to know is that graphic layout, your trade dress, what your book looks like, is, to my mind, just as important as the words in it. They work together to form a cohesive whole. if your product does not sell the same theme as your words, it's not as visually interesting and people don't get grabbed by it. Layout and text work together to form a complete whole. And you see this, like for example, and because of this, there's a visual shortcut language. If, for example, I see kind of a watercolory background thing with where the image starts fading in speckles towards the edge, I know that's a fantasy. I know that that's a fantasy book without even having to know anything else about the content, because that is very common in fantasy RPGs. If I see more harsh lines and hexagons, I'm in a science fiction book, and that helps sell that. Also, the big thing about layout is how your words are read. It's not just the pictures, it's also the words and the text. And if you pick the wrong font, if you pick the wrong font size, you are making your book less accessible and harder to read. If you pick a font color, like you pick a gray font color and you put it on a slightly grayish background, chances are, there was, I think the first edition of Wraith had some problems with that, where it picked I think it was a dark gray over a light gray. But the end result was, because the colors were so close together, it made it very hard to read. And especially these days, when we're trying to be more accessible and make things easier to read for people who, for example, have sight problems, or for people who are letting the computer read for them, it's important to have that text be as clear as possible, and that is the layout artist's job.
Yeah, totally.
Beyond that, just getting into it, look at everything, and don't look at it like, oh, that's neat. Ask yourself, why is that neat? And that just doesn't mean just books. That means video games. The single best layout I've ever seen everywhere is the layout for Persona 5. All the menus and the menus and the way the little things pop up over people's heads during combat. It's this gorgeous blending of function and style, which I've never seen duplicated anywhere else. Billboards, magazine ads, newspapers, all those are layouts. Look at them and ask yourself, you stop and say, oh, well, what are the elements? Break it down. I can see that this page has a border. I can see that this page has an illustration. I can see that the illustration has a border. I can see that this sidebar has a border, and the border is just at the top or the bottom, or the border is all the way around. And just start asking yourself what makes it work, and then start comparing. If you are, for example, thinking about getting the layout for a fantasy book, grab 5 or 6 fantasy books that you really like, fantasy RPGs that you really like, or supplements, and start comparing, seeing what they have in common, what they do differently. Because what they have in common is probably shorthand for this is a fantasy book. And what they do differently is how they differentiate themselves from their fantasy book and promote the specific feel. Hard fantasy as opposed to epic fantasy, as opposed to high fantasy, as opposed to steampunk fantasy, for example, all would have certain elements in common, but different elements which help differentiate them.
And that is some in-depth analysis, which I really love. Thank you for doing that. And I think there's a lot of goodness out there. Certainly, InDesign is expensive, but if you can swing it, I think it's worth it to get in there and start playing around. And there's tons of online tutorials and things like that too.
Yes, and over at Drive-Thru RPG's Discord server, there is a specific section just for people who are doing layout, and there's always people there to help you and answer questions.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really, really cool. I did not even know Drive-Thru had a Discord server.
They do for publishers, which includes anyone who puts out their stuff via DM's Guild or another community content program.
Nice. That is awesome. That is cool. So is there anything else that you have coming up that you would like to talk about?
Sure. Let's see. We have the Cyberpunk Red Core Rulebook, which is coming out target date, though target not a promise, late June.
Mm-hmm.
That
Cyberpunk Red, right?
Yes. And that is the new edition. It takes place in 2045. The edition everyone knows well is Cyberpunk 2020, which takes place in the 2020s. Video games 2077 takes place in 2077. Red is in between, and it helps bridge the historical gap between the two settings because they take place on the same timeline.
Sure.
So when you're playing that video game, it's canon to the RPG and vice versa.
Got it.
We are aiming for end of June. I don't have much in the way of writing in that, but I am the layout artist for it.
Oh, cool.
Yep. So very excited about that. Witcher's Journal, which is our bestiary that also talks about the Golden Age, the origins of the Witchers and the Witcher schools, and includes lore that's canon to the video games but never been seen before, is also June at some point. I wrote the investigation system in there and helped a little with the layout, though someone else did the majority of that. And then we just released, for Castle Falkenstein on Drive-Thru RPG, we just released Curious Creatures, which is a bestiary for Falkenstein. Firearms and Margarine, which is a mystery adventure in which you must solve the assassination of the leader of a fairy labor movement in Paris in the 1870s. And it's a lot of fun to write that. And Variations on the Great Game, which is a sort of like our Unchained or Unearthed Arcana, which includes a lot of new rule options for Falkenstein, ways to customize the game, new rules to firm things up here and there in case your table needs them, with often multiple options for each rule so that you can make sure it's the rule you want as opposed to just another rule at your table. And that's really it right now. Looking into the immediate future. Beyond that, there's some stuff on the horizon, but not quite sure we're ready to talk about that yet.
Well, I am excited to see all of this cool stuff when it emerges from our Talsorian Games. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to follow you and know more about what you're doing?
Best place, because I'm the media ambassador, when you're seeing our Talsorian Games talk online, that is me. So at our Talsorian Games over at Twitter. I think it's at official our Talsorian over on Instagram, and over on Facebook it is just our Talsorian Games Facebook group page, wall, whatever you want to call it, for our company. We do have a Discord server, which if you want to know, if I gave you a link now, it would be a jumble and it would probably be out of date by the time they got it. So people can just ask for it. We have a website at ourtalsoriangames.com, which is where you can find all kinds of information, as well as free DLC for our various games. We will be at Gen Con. Hopefully it happens. We are going to have a nice size booth. We are also going to have a room where our games are going to be taking place. So it should be fairly easy to find us, and you will be able to see all our new stuff there. And we'll be around online.
All right. That sounds great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you chatting with me today and coming on Tabletop Babble.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
That was a great interview with Jay. People, I just want you to know that Tabletop Babble will live on after episode 200, but episode 200 is my last episode as its host. Then the podcast will move over to the Geekspective Network, where Amber, John, and Kenny will take over hosting duties, and Amber is going to be the showrunner for this program. You won't have to do anything if you're already listening through a podcatcher. You'll just have the host change up. Other than that, you are going to love it. So if you could do me a favor, leave this show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Why am I asking you to do that? Because I want this show to head over to Geekspective with a really, really strong rating, as strong as it can be, so that lots and lots of people can find the show and the new amazing hosts. I cannot wait to be a listener of this program. I am really, really excited. They have some really cool stuff planned, and you will hear about it before I am done hosting. So go check it out over on Apple Podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating and tell them that you love them. And hey, you can find me on Twitter at James Intricasso and over at worldbuilderblog.com. Go check it out over there where you can follow all the cool game design stuff that I am doing. My Dad's Monster Manual is coming, people. Get ready to purchase your copy. Tabletop Babble is a show on the Don't Split the Podcast Network. Thanks to Rudy Basso for founding it with me. This episode was edited by Nate Pausenga. Our theme music, which you're listening to right now, was provided by BattleBards. Don't forget, RPGs are amazing, and so are you.
Dames and Dragons. Some have said, hilarious. Some have said, I cried. Some have said, it isn't just the best D&D content I've found, it's some of the best content I've experienced ever.
Some have said Corbin is the best part.
Well, some have said Fran is the best part.
Only you say that, Fran.
Some have said, shut up, Corbin!
Some have said, this podcast is jam on toast. Some being me, Leica.
Me, Leica, have said.
Me, Leica, this podcast.
Some have even dared to say, listen to Dames and Dragons, a D&D actual play podcast on Don't Split the Podcast Network.